We are live, ladies and gentlemen, MythVision podcast. I know you guys are excited about this. Which gospel came first, Matthew or Mark? Ladies and gentlemen, we are MythVision. What we're going to be discussing today, or having two gentlemen discuss today, is a vital situation. I think it changes the game depending on how one views the order in which the Gospels were written and the chronological order in which they came to be. A lot of scholarship hinges on these topics, and it's a very important one that we're going to hear debated today by Jonathan Sheffield and Professor Goodacre. But before we do, the gods want to show you guys something. Ladies and gentlemen, yes, I look better in that cartoon than I do in real life. And Jonathan Sheffield, who will be debating Dr. Goodacre today, created that intro. So may the force be with Jonathan today in some way for such a wonderful intro. I hear noise in the background. I wonder who that is. Ladies and gentlemen, we have both of our guests here popping up on the screen. This will be, I think, a very illuminating topic. And I don't want to spend too much time because our time is limited on going into much detail. So let's introduce them. And then we're going to let Jonathan go first with an opening. Dr. Goodacre can go and whatever you're interested in doing there, Dr. Goodacre, based on the intro, because our time will be limited to some extent. And then we'll have you guys engage back and forth the entire time. And then I'll try and make some time for the Q&A. So if you guys want to super chat it now. I'll screenshot your question and try to get to it. If for whatever reason I don't get your super chat, I do hope to visit Dr. Goodacre in person sometime in the future, and I can always do a follow-up show with Sheffield on these topics. So thank you all for showing love and support. Mark Goodacre is the Francis Hill Fox Professor of Religious Studies at Duke University, North Carolina, USA. He earned his master's in philosophy, his divinity, is it divinity? I'm sorry. DPhil, at University of Oxford. His research interests include the Gospels, the Apocryphal New Testament, and the historical Jesus. Goodacre is the author of 4 books, including The Case Against Q, Studies in Mark and Priority, and the Synoptic Problem, and Thomas and the Gospels. The case for Thomas's familiarity with the Synoptics. He is well known for creating web resources on New Testament and Christian origins, including his podcast, the New Testament Podcast. And that's in the description of the video. So if you want to go, subscribe to his podcast for sure. We're also going to make him a YouTube thing. So you guys are going to want to subscribe and check it out. Me and him have to talk about this. I want to help you grow that. Sure. Goodacre has acted as a consultant for several TV and radio programs, including The Passion, BBC, HBO 2008, and Finding Jesus in CNN 2015 to 17. Goodacre is currently working on a book on John's knowledge of the Synoptic Gospels, and I think you've completed that, if I'm not mistaken.
Not quite. I wish I had.
Okay, you said this summer, but then again, I get it.
Working on it.
Jonathan Sheffield is a member of the Anglican Communion. Being born and raised in the Episcopal Church, he has defended its historical positions and high church polity. Over the last 5 years, Jonathan has created a new genre of Christian apologetics followed after the spirit of C.S. Lewis by fashioning them into second and third animations. Am I saying that correct?
2D and 3D animations.
Got it. Okay. second and third. What am I talking about? His area of focus is defending the reliability of the New Testament and how we got the text of the New Testament. Jonathan Sheffield has had the opportunity to defend his thesis against such notable scholars as Dr. Bart Ehrman, Dr. Richard Carrier, Matthew Dillahunty, and the famed Dr. Robert Price. Jonathan Sheffield has recently joined Explained International Apologetics, which is organized by Samuel Nassan and Dr. Stephen Boyce. Ladies and gentlemen, let's listen to what Jonathan has to say here, and I'll share the screen. And let's see. We're going to disappear. Go ahead, Jonathan.
Okay. Now, to open up my dialogue with Dr. Goodacre, I would like to outline the intended plan of action while judicially addressing tonight's question. First and foremost, my objective is to document the empirical standards by which to identify, build, and trust a reliable history. After establishing this foundation, I will report on the methodological problems of the working hypothesis that Mark came first, out of the multitude of divergent theories regarding synoptic relationships, while documenting the philosophical framework that cultivated this worldview. Lastly, I aim to bring attention to the overwhelming weight of empirical and patristic data in support of Matthean priority. Now, in building our case, we first turn our attention to the methods of historical investigation and exemplars of the process. According to Dr. Richard Carrier, there's a major reason why modern historians hold such men as Thucydides, Polybius, and Arrian in high esteem. It's because they often discuss where they get their information, how they got their information, and what they did with it. It is their open and candid consciousness of the problems posed by writing a critical history that marks them as especially competent. In the case of Arrian's project to construct an empirical history of the campaigns of Alexander, his chief aim was to set before the reader not an empty parade of words, but what he was able to collect from the best authenticated records. The preparations for the projects commenced with the selection of his primary sources and chief guides. The principal documents he chose as the foundation for his work were the writings of Aristobulus and Ptolemy. The writings of these witnesses were selected because they shared Alexander's campaigns, which afforded them the opportunity to report on what they directly saw and heard. Arrian's critical engagement with the records of the past sought to produce a truthful, accurate history among the abundance of material by selecting records with relevant and competent knowledge of the events. The next phase of the project focused on ensuring that the testimonies of his primary sources were thoroughly examined and reliable. To gauge the truthfulness and accuracy of his witness statement, Arrian's policy consisted of confirming several credibility factors during his analysis. At the onset of the evaluation, Arrian factored whether these witnesses had a motive to lie, and if they had hoped to politically or socially benefit through their publications. In effect, Arrian executed a standard procedural investigative technique known as cui bono. In doing so, Arrian uncovers an important fact. Alexander had already passed away when these men wrote, so there was no pressure upon either of them to culminate a history as a kind of scholastic performance for Alexander. Additionally, neither would have otherwise profited from the falsification of facts, given that such an act would have brought dishonor upon their names. This is particularly true for Ptolemy, who himself was a king. Furthermore, Arrian equally analyzed the witnesses' competency in terms of background and experience to speak on military matters. This practice at its core is the ancient equivalent of Federal Rules of Evidence 702. That is the application of expert witnesses with specialized knowledge to help the trier of the fact to understand the evidence. But most importantly, Arrian thoroughly scrutinized whether the statements of record could be corroborated by independent witnesses. The doctrine in the law of evidence contains an unwavering rule. Material facts must be proven by evidence from two independent sources. This directive is further emphasized by Dr. Bart Ehrman, who asserts that multiple attestation is one of the most important historical criteria for establishing what happened in the past. Not just for historical Jesus research, but for any serious historical research. If there are several sources available that independently indicate that an event happened, then no one of them could have made it up, since they all report it without having conferred with one another. Some scholars see this criteria as the most important one available for establishing what happened in the past. Moreover, there is no miscarriage of justice on the rule of corroboration, which results in two lying witnesses instead of one. For the benefit of two lying witnesses is that it should be easier to flush them out, expressly by private and separate examination of each witness. This procedural precedent is clearly established in the story of Susanna and the elders, a principle understood in both Hellenistic and Judeo-Christian philosophies. In accordance with these factors, Arrian was able to proceed to the final phase of his project in authenticating and selecting the historical content for final publication in accordance with the following criteria. Wherever Ptolemy and Aristobulus in their histories of Alexander gave the same account, he followed it on the assumption of its accuracy. Wherever their facts differed, he selected what was more probable and compelling. Where applicable, he also included the details of the events as reported by other writers. Upon examining these factors, Arrian's strict methodology in creating a comprehensive history of the campaigns of Alexander clearly demonstrates the empirical standards by which to build and trust a reliable history. However, the worldview that Dr. Goodacre subscribes to, which forms the basis of a belief on a narrative that Mark came first, leaves much to the imagination. For this school of thought's attempt to write at large a history of the details of what have taken place in the apostolic churches, beginning with a relation of how the gospel publications came to be, has no Aristobulus or Ptolemy as its foundation. In fact, Dr. Goodacre's theory possesses no supporting empirical documentation from any presiding bishop, member of the clergy, or parishioner within the ancient government of the apostolic churches. To emphasize this point, there is no ancient record from the episcopal seats of Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, Edessa, Smyrna, North Africa, or any other ecclesiastical branch that documents such an event as a matter of history. From our discussion thus far, we've established the definitive doctrine that material facts must be proven by evidence from two independent sources. However, this hypothesis has none. Therefore, they have not met the legal standards of evidence in support of this thesis. At best, this narrative that Mark was first can only be classified as either metafiction, a postmodern narrative, or even the results of the Rorschach's inkblot test, but not actual history. Consequently, when we come up against this school of thought's assumptions regarding synoptic relationships, an umbrella under which Dr. Goodacre's form of the Farrar-Golder hypothesis resides, a similar pattern emerges. A representative case of this chief problem is found in John Wenham's report, which discusses the state of affair amongst the great majority of scholars in the 20th century, who have held to some form of the two-document hypothesis, believing Mark came first, and that Matthew and Luke independently built their Gospels out of Mark and possibly another source. Upon examination, Wenham issues the following verdict. Judging by the attitude of members of recent gospel conferences, most scholars who have examined particularly impressed with this logical weight. Yet they find no other theory convincing, and they have been content to go along with the majority and accept it as a working hypothesis. This view is also echoed by Robinson. To substantiate this point, Wenham cites G.B. Tyson's assessment of the Bellazzini collection, which features the most significant articles in the critical appraisal of the two-source hypothesis. Following a thorough examination, Tyson concludes, after reading these essays, it is difficult to avoid the conclusion that nothing convincing has emerged from this long and torturous discussion. Wenham rightly observes that much of the argumentation in support of modern synoptic relationships is worth very little because they could be argued either way with approximate value. Case in point, Augustine's literary analysis concluded that Mark appeared to be an abridgment of Matthew. By contrast, Dr. Goodacre's research suggests Matthew is a derivative of Mark. Moreover, Dr. John Robinson's honorable mention of E.P. Sanders' study on the tendencies of the synoptic tradition culminates the same fate for this school of thought's view on synoptic relationships. He writes, "The evidence does not seem to warrant the degree of certainty which many scholars hold the two-document hypothesis. It would also seem to forbid a similar degree of certainty should be accorded any other hypothesis. Who maintains their conclusions when the hypothesis continues to fail? It is precisely this reason that Wenham asked the quintessential question: has something gone wrong with our methodology? The answer isn't conclusive yet, but allow me to explain the intricate background behind this conclusion, which will provide additional insight into the historical development that brought about the modern consensus. First, the methodological problems are the byproduct of a worldview that was cultivated during a major shift in philosophies beginning in the German schools of the 18th century. Concerning this philosophical shift, Dr. Stephen Hicks writes that Kant is the turning point and the first major step towards postmodernism. In the history of philosophy, Kant marked a fundamental shift from objectivity as a standard to subjectivity as a standard. With Kant, truth is redefined on subjective grounds. Consequently, the ideas and beliefs of Kant represent a break within the empirical method of epistemology. His influence within this school of thought cannot be neglected, considering Kant is the exemplar of the defining spirit of this period of history in the scholarly guild. After 1700 years, it was the culmination of this zeitgeist, which constituted a break with empiricism and the introduction of postmodernism, that gave birth to the idea in 1786 by the German professor Stohr that Mark was first, not the introduction of new empirical data. Since ideas of this nature, and notably those of Weiss and Holtzman, were able to cultivate an environment based in the continental philosophy for the next 200 years, this best explains the emergence and dominance of those theories in the academy. When combined, these schools of thought formed the foundation upon which the modern day consensus was initially built, a conclusion that the academy is rapidly losing confidence in. As Wenham has noted, there can be no solution using faulty methods. Therefore, why not accept the empirical observations of the apostolic polity and the records of the notable historians and presiding bishops of the apostolic churches on these matters? The writings of such reputable dignitaries as Irenaeus, Origen, Jerome, Eusebius, Augustine, and Chrysostom unquestionably present relevant and competent knowledge of the events, who were able to report on what they directly saw and heard. This objective framework is successful in that it establishes independent attestation over a wide geographic network in affirming Matthew as the first written and published gospel to the apostolic churches. Additionally, this framework testifies to the sources for the synoptic records and presents key details regarding the time, place, and circumstances for the publications that are contrary to the narrative proposed by the modern consensus. Evidence for this fact can be initially traced in the wealth of state and church government records furnished to us by the famed court historian and de facto librarian of Pamphilus, Eusebius. His unwavering desire to present the truth regarding the facts and the results exhibits the true instincts of a historian, a designation well recognized by his peers. Eusebius' investigative techniques into the chronology, formation, and distribution of the gospel records parallels the unequivocal empirical methods of Arian. Eusebius definitely states his deduction that Matthew was first is founded on the written records of the earliest presbyters and historians of the apostolic churches. In demanding solid evidence for the circumstances which he records, Eusebius produces three material witnesses with relevant and competent knowledge of the events that each testify to the validity of the fact. The reports he garners are corroborated and independent. Moreover, our case that Matthew is first is independently confirmed by Jerome, Augustine, Irenaeus, Origen, and the Greek, Latin, and Aramaic apostolic churches that were witnesses and guardians of the text. The law of evidence requires two independent witnesses. We have thousands. What's more, there are no genuine issues of material facts between these witnesses. Additionally, what would have been the motive and political benefit for the ancients to falsify their records to certify Matthew as first? Whereas a view that Mark was the first to reveal and publish the written words of the gospel at Rome would have certainly been championed by the churches of Rome, Antioch, and Alexandria as the sees of Peter, just as Rome boasts of Peter's primacy and his death in Rome. This testimony would render a conclusive verdict in any normal court of law. Yet, in the modern footnotes that line the works of the ancients, we read, in spite of the evidence of Clement, Origen, and Eusebius himself, most modern scholars regard Mark's gospel as the first. This statement reflects a worldview where facts don't matter. In conclusion, due to the abundance of historical evidence, it is difficult to contest the facts for the chronology of the gospel records, in that Matthew was published and distributed first to the apostolic churches. This history is established by the uniform testimony of so many men in so many times. Thorough testimony of this nature should be recognized and given the credit and authority of common history. At this point, I turn it over to Dr. Goodacre. Thank you for allowing me to present my thesis to you.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that, Jonathan. And Dr. Goodacre, please, how would you want to go about this? It's up to you.
I'm happy just to respond to what Jonathan has so interestingly put forward and just take those points. I'll take 5 or 10 minutes to give us more time for conversation, for to and fro, and for other people to get involved, if that's okay. I'd like to say, I suppose, straight off the bat that it's an enormous pleasure to talk to Jonathan Sheffield and to be back with my friend Derek again on the podcast. And let's just jump straight into one of the major things that Jonathan said there. He talked about the ancient evidence and talked about it as being a question of multiple attestation. Now, multiple attestation is important when you have independent witnesses. And Jonathan said towards the end there that several of the witnesses are independent. I don't think they are. Eusebius, when Eusebius is writing those passages, is writing a summary of things that he has read. So Eusebius isn't independent of these people. And what happens is, one informs another. These people knew one another, knew one another's writings. And so then what you have to do when you look at things, you don't just look at multiple attestation, you try and look at early independent multiple attestation. And that's what's lacking in this case. The first person that Jonathan lists is Irenaeus. When's Irenaeus writing? Irenaeus is writing at the end of the 2nd century. This is a century or so after, I think, Mark's gospel has been written. That's already quite a substantial amount of time. And we do have earlier witnesses who don't specify Matthew as the first gospel. So the earliest our evidence takes us is Papias. Papias does not, as far as we know, say that Matthew was the first gospel. We only know him through quotations in Eusebius. So if we go to our very earliest evidence, Papias, we don't have the confirmation that Jonathan's looking for. I then want to say, this idea that what we're looking for is multiple independent witnesses is problematic when you're coming to documents. Because in a court of law today, if you are trying somebody for plagiarism, it is perfectly acceptable to get an expert on literary relationships to look at 2 documents and say, is this one dependent on this one? And that's exactly what synoptic problem scholars like me do. They look at these things forensically. They say, can you find Mark's redactional fingerprints in Matthew? Can you find Matthew's redactional fingerprints in Luke? Can you find synoptic redactional fingerprints in Thomas, and so on? And the vast majority of scholars think that Matthew used Mark because the evidence all seems to push in that direction when you put the two documents side by side. That's why it's so important to get a copy of a gospel synopsis and compare things one by one. You compare Matthew with Mark, compare Mark with Luke, and say, is it more likely that Luke is derived from Mark, that Matthew is derived from Mark, than the reverse? And that's what you do all the time. You just simply ask those questions. So you look at the direction of traffic. So Jonathan said that you can argue the case when you look at the parallels between Matthew and Mark either way. I beg to differ. I think that it's difficult to argue the case either way. And one of the reasons why people like me argue for Markan priority is because when we read arguments for Matthean priority, it's often difficult to make sense of the specific evidence in passage by passage cases. So it's very easy to argue in the abstract. So I like examples. I like getting down to the nitty gritty. So let me give you an example. When Mark tells the story of the death of John the Baptist in Mark 6, he has a fairly coherent, rather bizarre story, but a coherent story in which Herodias, Herod Antipas's wife, wants to see John the Baptist killed. Now, in Matthew's version of this story, in Matthew 14, what he does is he abbreviates, as he often does, and the assumption is using Mark, and what happens is he makes Herod the person who wants to see John die. And then, because of the way that Matthew is abbreviating and he's copying from Mark, he sort of drifts into Mark's wording as you go through. And he kind of forgets by the middle of the story that he had said that Herod wanted Jesus killed. And he says, when Herodias, and through her daughter, asked for the head of John the Baptist, he says, the king grieved. It doesn't make any sense in Matthew, say the king grieved. It makes sense in Mark, because Herodias wanted him killed. And what's more, you can verify this, because in Mark, all the way through, he calls this Herod Antipas, a king. Now, Herod Antipas wasn't a king. He was a tetrarch. He was a ruler of a fourth. Matthew seems to know this because he corrects Mark to Herod the Tetrarch at the beginning of the story. But then, halfway through the story, he drifts into the wording of his source, as quite often ancient writers do. And he says, the king grieves, uses Mark's terminology. What's more, in that same passage, Matthew begins telling it as a sort of flashback, and by the end of the story, he's forgotten he's telling it as a flashback, and he just picks up the story as if it was part of the normal narrative. So in text after text like that, it's much more plausible that Matthew is copying Mark than the reverse. And just to take another famous example, this isn't just some wacky example that I've come up with. This is in all the introductory textbooks. When the rich young ruler comes up to Jesus and says to Jesus, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus says in Mark's gospel, "Why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone." In Matthew, the line is changed. "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus responds now, not, "Why do you call me good?" He says, "Why do you ask me about good? No one is good but God alone. There's one who is good, God." And that's typical of the kind of thing that you see in Matthew's gospel, because Matthew consistently makes sense on the assumption that he is rewriting imaginatively, creatively, what he finds in Mark's gospel. I wrote an article recently called the Orthodox Redaction of Mark, in which I argued that what Matthew does is he kind of saves Mark for orthodoxy, because what he does is he sees those potentially problematic elements in Mark and he tidies them up, he corrects them. You can see this all the way through Matthew. You even see it in the way that Mark's grammar is kind of touched up. You can see it in the kind of stuff that Matthew omits from Mark. Matthew omits very little from Mark, but the kind of things that he does appear to omit are things that make sense as somebody who would want to omit them. So there's a story in Mark's gospel where basically there's a man who is blind. Jesus heals him, but it takes him a couple of goes to heal him. Like the first time he says, what do you see? And the man says, "Well, I see people like trees walking around." So it takes, and then Jesus has another go, and then he gets healed. So what happens is you get this kind of steady healing process. You can imagine why someone like Matthew doesn't like that. He doesn't want limits on Jesus's ability. So once more, it makes sense to see Matthew as a version of Mark, rather than as something that Mark is derived from. And there's a reason why all of those early church authors really love Matthew's gospel. And it's because it's a much fuller gospel. It's got so much of the content that's in Mark's gospel. So they thought, great, well, we've got that stuff. But then in addition, we've got the Sermon on the Mount. We've got the Lord's Prayer. We've got parables like the parable of the talents and the 10 virgins and all sorts of things that are absent from Mark. We have a birth narrative in which you have wise men coming to see Jesus. So of course they preferred Matthew. And what's more, it became consensus from surprisingly early that Matthew's gospel was written by one of Jesus's disciples, the tax collector, Matthew. And so, of course, the early fathers thought, well, it must have been the apostles who wrote the earliest gospels, people like Matthew, not secondary people like Mark, right? So that actually gets embedded very quickly into the retelling of the whole story. So I would say, and it's difficult to summarize that whole case in like 5 or 10 minutes. And Derek very kindly mentioned my podcast. If you want to listen to the podcast, I do have a few episodes where I talk about Mark and priority and why I think it's a plausible case. I've also written a couple of books about it, as Derek also kindly mentioned. And the case, I think, is one of those things where the more you look at the detail, the stronger it gets. Sometimes people talk about, losing the wood for the trees and so on. Actually, in the case of this, on line after line after line, just like forensic document examiners, what you see when you look at Matthew is you see a gospel that makes sense on the assumption that he's trying to rewrite and fix things that he sees as being problematic in Mark's gospel. So just to conclude these thoughts in a response to Jonathan, I would say that Matthew makes sense if Mark is the first gospel. It's easy to understand Matthew if Mark's the first gospel. It's much harder to understand Mark if Matthew is the first gospel.
All right. So technically, Mark is Mark in priority because his first name is after the gospel. That's it. That's all I got out of that whole thing. I'm just kidding. So, gentlemen, if you will, I'm going to escape this discussion and allow you two to engage. This way, there's no interference. And thank you for the openings. I appreciate it.
Sure.
Yeah. And once again, thank you, Dr. Goodacre, to share your thoughts on this. And, some of these questions are really to help me better understand some of the scholarship in the academy. Some of the quotations I provided from John Wyndham, who indicated you personally know, he felt from the quotations that he provided that there is decreasing confidence in the academy with this school. And it makes me wonder, is even at the exception of this idea that Mark was first, is maybe a lack of empirical basis why maybe scholars like Bauer and Greisbach held on to Matthew as first, because obviously Greisbach is following Origen. So do you think it had to do with the lack of empirical documentation from the ancient world to accept it? I'll let you share your thoughts.
You see, yeah. Well, first of all, thanks. I mean, I was very lucky to know John Wyndham when I was a graduate student in Oxford. He's been dead for some years, but he used to come along to our New Testament seminars, which were led by Ed Sanders, who's another person that you mentioned, and a very, very, very genial and kind person. When he knew I was working on the synoptic problem, he invited me for tea. So we used to go and have tea, and we would debate just as we are doing now. He would debate these issues. But I don't like, I'll be honest with you, Jonathan, I don't like the way you keep using this word empirical, because I think you're using it almost like a kind of magic wand. I think it's kind of, you feel if you say the word empirical enough, it's going to make people go, oh, shoot, it sounds like this stuff is really serious. And I think the thing is, it's just as empirical when I compare Matthew with Mark and say, this makes more sense as the source and this makes more sense as the derivation, so I'm not sure about the way you're using that. I think the way I would divide this up, it's a question of external and internal evidence.
Okay.
And I think it would be fair to say that you are stressing the external evidence more and I'm stressing the internal evidence more. But then I would argue that you have to stress the internal evidence more, because when you are doing forensic style document examination, you get into what you can actually see in front of you rather than what somebody might have said about it many, many years later on, right? Like trying to work out who Jack the Ripper's killer is now is a lot harder than it would have been at the time, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I apologize for the computer. Yeah, what I mean is definitely external versus the internal evidence. Now, do you think Irenaeus, I mean, obviously he was a member of the Church of Smyrna, and it's an actual church. We know who the bishop is from the external evidence. Do you think someone like Irenaeus, who in his writings, he is appealing to the polity or the objective framework of the church? So going in, I know people within the church, I can see what documents we have there, and I have people with relevant and competent knowledge. And the same could be said for Origen, for Clement of Alexandria, Eusebius, who's looking at, are they able to look at the information that they have and come to this conclusion?
Are we talking Irenaeus of Lyon, Bishop of Lyon? I mean Irenaeus, yeah, is obsessed with trying to get some sense of what the he wants to kind of he wants to assert what the correct church doctrine is and rule on what he thinks false church doctrine was. And one of the very important things for him is to establish which books can be relied upon and which books can't. So he very much wants to stress that Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, those and those only can be trusted. It's a secondary question to him how they were interrelated. And I think it's fair to say that that's true for many of the people that you're talking about. They weren't actually that interested in the idea that one had copied from another or one was derived from another. They were much more interested insofar as they're interested in the question at all about whether they were apostolic or not. And of course, they argue that they're all apostolic. So yes, there's a sort of, he is trying to stress, Irenaeus is trying to stress apostolic origins. That's definitely there. But whether or not that means that they did originate with apostles is a completely different question.
Mm-hmm. Now, on that, just to kind of follow up on your conversation regarding the literary analysis. Now, Augustine, in his works, does do what I at least look at as a literary analysis. He did identify that the parallels, the wording, the counts, was very close between Matthew and Mark. Now, he obviously came to a different conclusion. He felt like it appeared that Mark was following after Matthew. But we also have Chrysostom in his preface to Matthew is sort of doing his version of a literary analysis of that as well. So I was wondering if you can share your thoughts on Augustine's and Chrysostom's view, and where you think where they're coming to different conclusions with yourself.
No, I mean, I think there's actually a surprising consensus amongst these early church writers that Matthew is the first gospel. I'm not going to dispute that point at all. I think you go from Irenaeus onwards, and that's pretty much undisputed. And in fact, there's pretty much consensus. This is slightly more controversial, but there's almost consensus, I think, amongst the early writers on which the second gospel was. They think it was Mark, and then Luke comes third. The only thing that puts a spanner in the works there is it's possible that Clement of Alexandria thinks that Mark was the third gospel, because he makes this statement that the gospels with the genealogies were written before Mark's gospel. But in a very persuasive article, Stephen Carlson suggests that that's a mistranslation. And in fact, he's not saying Matthew and Luke are written before Mark. He's saying Matthew and Luke were written publicly, whereas Mark was written in private. And that coheres with what a lot of other early church authors say about these things. And that actually means that there is pretty much consensus. If that's right, if Carlson's right, and I think he is, that means there's pretty much consensus between Irenaeus, Augustine, Clement, others, that Mark doesn't come third as Griesbach had it, but actually came earlier. But yeah, I mean, that's what I mean. I mean, so I take it that you see, I don't think that Matthew's Gospel is written by a disciple of Jesus. I don't think that. I think it's a much later document. I think it's post 70. Do I take it that you think this is written by what, Matthew the tax collector?
Yeah, and part of that, not only the external testimony, but do you feel with the rise of Christianity, obviously Tacitus in his writings understands that the origins of Christianity that eventually came to his city originated in Judea, and it very successfully propagated itself down over the course of the next 300 years. But what we see is a pattern of, we have churches in Judea, we have Jerusalem, we have Antioch, which right there in Syria. Do you feel during that period of history, let's say after Christ's ministry, that there was a need to supplement the churches with actual writings? Because if we follow some of the documentation, it's, Matthew wrote of necessity. He wanted to reach, Judeans, his people. Obviously, we have churches being set up in Jerusalem, Antioch, Galilee. And then what we see surprisingly afterwards is almost from Suetonius, that there's this Christus character. The Jewish quarters are getting very upset. Does that concur with now a necessity for another gospel for the people of Rome at that time?
Well, I'm not sure that life works like that, Jonathan. I think the way that life works is somebody thinks they want to write something, they write it. And it might be that occasionally you have somebody who said, hey, can you write this for us? And I think that may well be what happened with Luke's gospel. I mean, Luke, as you know, begins with this interesting preface where he says, most excellent Theophilus. Now, some people have speculated Theophilus is fictional. He might be. But I mean, he could be Luke's patron. It could be that there was some guy called Theophilus that says, I need someone to tell me this story. Okay, who can I get? Lucas of Corinth, good guy. Can you do some research for me? Find out. And he gets a hold of a copy of Mark's gospel, Matthew's gospel. It's a bit more research, wax together this piece. Could be that that's how that worked. But the fact is, we don't know how these things happened. And I think, like today, one of the reasons that people wrote is because they felt like doing it. And so it's not always that they were writing to fill a need in the church or whatever. And of course, the vast majority of stuff that was written in antiquity is lost anyway. The reason that these survive is that the stuff that people really liked, the stuff that people kept on copying, so they went forward by their own momentum. So I don't know. I think maybe one of the differences between us, Jonathan, is that you are much more sanguine about what you think we can know about the earliest century or two. I think that it's its own kind of dark age in a way, and that there's nothing. I mean, I think if I may, I think I want to press you a bit more on this question of Matthew being a disciple. Does it? I mean, okay, so where does it come from? Does Matthew, if this is Matthew the tax collector, does he speak Greek?
Well,
I mean,
I would think as the profession, as a tax collector. Now, as a Levite, he would be a member of the writing class of the family of writers. This is part of their vocation. As a tax collector, he would have to keep records for the Roman Empire. Obviously, they were very in tune to what income was coming in. And I think he fits a particular person. Now, once again, that is the person of interest identified with every church. Now, the text at one point had to be handed over to the churches. So these are physical communities of churches. They have leadership. They're appointing of bishops and elders. So someone's coming into contact. So if an author is making their work known, and I think we both agree that if we go to all the churches, we find these documents. So that's not under dispute. The question is over the transfer and control of these documents, which came into being. So I do need a mechanism. Obviously, Matthew fits that mechanism to introduce a work into the actual congregations in obviously Jerusalem, Antioch, and we have writings indicated from Hippolytus, Eusebius, that the work was actually taken to India, and when Panias in Alexandria went to the churches of India, he found it. So is that consistent enough to tell us that?
Well, I want something just on a much more prima, sorry, I don't want to use fancy Latin terms. I was going to say prima facie. Well, I mean, but first look, it doesn't look to me like this is a eyewitness book. I mean, he doesn't even, so when you get to the story of the call of Matthew in Matthew 9, he doesn't say, and then I, went up and I saw Jesus and I did this. He just says, Matthew did this, Matthew did that. There's not the first person that's never used in Matthew's gospel. The gospel isn't claiming to be eyewitness, is it? And then, is he shy? Is that what's the literary conceit there? Because people at the time often use the first person. You go to 2nd and 3rd century gospels. It's amazing what they're claiming. They're Jesus's twin brother. They're James, Jesus's brother. They're Peter. They're Mary. I mean, they're not nervous about making these claims, but. Why is Matthew so coy about saying that if he's Matthew? And the same question for John, if you think that, John wrote John. I mean, I'm curious about how you put that,
and very good question. I think first and foremost, if I look to some of the internal evidence, I think maybe you'd agree that Matthew is the only one that uses the epitaph. The tax collector. Now, we don't find that in Mark, Luke, and John. He speaks more of the taxation system. So if you see consistent with trade, he brings up the temple tax.
17, yeah.
And it almost.
But even there, it's with Peter, isn't it? I mean, you're hanging out with Jesus for, however many years it was. And the only story that you can tell about the temple tax is some story about how Peter goes and finds a coin in a fish's mouth. And a lot of people see that story and let's be frank, a lot of people are really skeptical about that story. They think that it doesn't have the ring of truth to it. It sounds like legend. It sounds like, a story that, do people really go finding coins in fish's mouths? So even when you get a story about tax and taxation, it doesn't sound like the kind of thing that you would imagine an eyewitness saying. Is it? Do you? I don't know. I'm struggling with that one.
Well, when I look at what they're doing, and I think Chrysostom goes a little bit into this point. That they're writing from their vantage point, and when we look at, it's almost like when we look at Mark, it's kind of shaky. It's almost like he's listening to someone preach, which would fit with some of the internal data. Obviously, when we look at Matthew, but I think what's interesting about their observations, and Chrysostom noticed this, is that they're 4 writers writing from different vantage points. While I would definitely agree that they're aware of each other's writings, I wouldn't. If Mark is second, he's obviously aware of Matthew's being published to Jerusalem, where Peter was at. He's obviously aware of this. But I also noticed that they're writing from an observation or a vantage point. So it's almost like we don't see in there about Peter's wife. You would think this would be an observation. Now, we know Jesus heals the mother-in-law, but we don't hear anything about the wife. And to think about that, we don't hear a lot of observations about Jesus either, which tells me,
that's kind of my point.
Yeah,
that's what bothers me.
But if you're reporting, so if I'm Matthew, which when we look at the Didache, it seems to indicate, at least from my perspective, that It is following Matthew. It recognizes it as, the Lord's gospel, which would indicate that Matthew was the scribe of the group, being his profession. Shorthand was in the area for a very long time. They've had writing in there, which explains what they're doing is they're writing down what's being reported.
I'll certainly give you that Matthew is the gospel that most stresses scribes. And I think I always say to my students that if you want a key verse in Matthew's gospel, go to 13:52. Every scribe discipled in the kingdom of heaven is like the householder that draws from his store both the new and the old. It's a very Matthean thing to say. And in fact, one of my teachers, John Fenton, and I never knew whether he was being facetious or not, he argued that that's where Matthew actually did put his signature on the book, because the Greek word for discipled is matheteuthes, which sounds very much like the name Matthew. But I suspect he was just being a little, he was saying that with a nod and a wink. But if the Gospels are at least familiar with one another, how do you explain their near verbatim identity at points? Because Matthew is astonishingly close to Mark sometimes. I mean, he goes over whole sentences at a time. So why does Mark copy Matthew verbatim? Or let me not prejudge the question. Why does Mark sound so like Matthew? I mean, if it depends on Peter's preaching, I don't get that. I've never been able to understand that.
Yeah, no, and it's a fair assessment. I think Wenham definitely does bring it up. I mean, it's striking. You would almost think that, hey, this is almost the same account. I know Augustine brought up the numerical count, and I mean, even me looking at certain passages, it's like this reads almost the same in wording, the same parallel passages, but what I like to tie this to, and I know Chrysostom goes into this argument, it's almost like if you and me were experiencing the event of Jack Ruby, going into the, police station. Now, obviously there was witnesses, it was on TV. Now, if we were getting information on that particular event, and now, even though I'm kind of shrinking it down, I think you see where I'm going. What do we expect to hear from the people that witnessed that event? It would be almost a very close representation. It would almost match verbatim of what actually happened on that event. So, and this is the point that Chrysostom makes, is that there's enough differences in there that they're all seeing. I mean, synoptic, if we look at it, it means seeing with one eye. Isn't this what we expect for witnesses observing the same events?
Definitely not. No, I think we might here have got really to the heart of our disagreement. The way that you see, I think the way that I look at it, I'd go back to my analogy of like forensic documents examiners. I think if you've got three works, and I'm just concentrating on Matthew, Mark, and Luke because John's a bit different. If you've got three works that are as similar as those three are, and there is no literary connection, then plagiarists in the current era could walk free. I mean, I've been teaching for about 30 years or so, and I've had many cases in that time of plagiarism, and I mean, of others. I mean, I don't do it. Other people, students. Students committing plagiarism, and one of the common arguments they come up with is they say, "Yeah, but look at all the different bits, right? Look at all this stuff that's different." No plagiarist could ever get off on that. No plagiarist can ever say when someone says, "Just look, you've copied this bit out." You can't say, "Yeah, but look at all this other stuff I didn't copy," right? And I think the thing is, it's so. You see, Matthew and Mark, just to stick to those two, they're so similar at certain points. And this isn't just like in Jesus's words. So it's not like they've both got fantastic memories of Jesus's words, although even that's problematic because you'd still have to translate them identically into Greek. But it's that the narrators even talk the same way. So there's a famous bit in Mark 13, which of course you'll know, but some of the viewers might not, where the narrator breaks into Jesus's apocalyptic discourse. You've got the apocalyptic discourse, and Jesus breaks in. Sorry, the narrator breaks in both Mark 13 and in Matthew 26 and says, "Let the reader understand." Now, That's not two independent witnesses remembering the thing the same way. They're specifically drawing attention to the reader of the document. So Mark's narrator talks the same as Matthew's narrator. And that's repeated. You get this, that the narrators talk the same way. And the thing is, you and I, Jonathan, have said some of the same words and even possibly one or two phrases that are similar in this, but we don't go on for whole sentences at a time like they do in the synoptics. So I think on your Jack Ruby analogy, and I do like that because I as a kid, I was fascinated by the whole Kennedy shooting and the aftermath and everything. But I think where that breaks down is that when you look at the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you aren't looking at something that looks like three independent accounts of something. They just don't look like that. That doesn't mean that, for example, Luke might not have had additional sources to, in my view, Matthew and Mark, and that Matthew might have had additional sources to Mark. But it does mean that where you see these close similarities, the best explanation has to be a literary one. And that's one of the things to me is just as real fundamental. And I know John Wenham differed on that, but I disagree with him strongly on that.
Yeah, and once again, I do understand the perspective, and to go into this a little bit more. Now, when we look at the scenario, so obviously if we identify Matthew as a person of interest, now obviously he would have had access to Peter. This is not just a own individual. Peter was there. He had access to him. Obviously, Mark, if we're looking, right now at the external testimony that brought about the gospel, that Mark is using Peter as his source. And then we even take some of the commentary from Eusebius, from the eternal data that Luke, who obviously, or who's identified as a companion of Paul, also had access not only to Peter, but it appears that he may have also had access to Mary, which may explain, some of the genealogies between him and Matthew. So is really the common connection here that Peter is the key witness between three that kind of solves?
No, it can't be, because of the kind of thing I mentioned about let the reader understand. That's not Peter talking. This is the narrator presupposing readers of a literary text. Or to take another example, you've got in both Matthew 9 and Mark 2, you've got the story of the paralyzed man. In Mark's gospel, he's let down through the roof. That detail's missing in Matthew. Matthew often condenses. And at the end of that story, you have Jesus saying, in order that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on the earth to forgive sins, comma, he says to the paralytic, get up. The way that they structure it is identical. So you have like Jesus's words, a broken off sentence, the narrator then coming in, and then Jesus's words resuming. It's just not the kind of thing that you see when you have two people independently describing the same thing. There's a literary link there. I think it's just, I mean, I'll be frank with you. I think it's really difficult to dispute. And those who have disputed it have generally done what you've done and said, yeah, but there's lots of differences. I know there's loads of differences. I mean, John's even more different from the synoptics, and I think John knew the synoptics as well, though that's a story for another day. The differences will never diagnose non-familiarity, but similarities will always, I think, diagnose some kind of relationship. That's what one has. That's just the way that one has to do that. And to use a modern analogy, the Gospel of Jesus' Wife in 2012, lots of us said, we think this is a forgery. We think it's been copied off the internet. One of the reasons that we thought it had been copied off the internet is that it had some telltale signs of having been copied from an internet interlinear that was designed by Michael Grondin. And it turned out that was the case. I mean, but we didn't need the external evidence. The external evidence later backed it up. Wonderful book by Ariel Sabar, in which he talks about the whole case. The external evidence, once Ariel Sabar went and met the owner of the fragment, who'd been in the shadows for so long, who's clearly connected, to the forgery of it, it confirmed everything that the document examiners had been saying. So document examination does yield good results. we can see cases where this is the case. And even outside of this field, Hitler diaries, people were suspicious about the Hitler diaries before it became very, very clear that they were forgers. Now, nobody defends their authenticity. So I think document examination is important. I think it has to be one of the key players, if not the key player, in this kind of debate.
No, and I don't want to get off the impression that literary analysis is bad. I think it has a lot of value. I think it's added to the subject of textual criticism and others. But do you think, now, obviously, Robinson kind of pushed the narrative that there's a lot more in the academy starting to move more towards the Reisbach hypothesis. Now,
there used to be. That's waning now. In the when he wrote that, I would say, especially in the USA, the Griesbach hypothesis was the dominant alternative to the two-source theory. I think now that's not true. I think the dominant alternative to the two-source theory is the theory I advocate. And I'm not just saying that because it's me.
No,
I actually think that it has. I actually think now it's fair to say that there are more people who would argue for Markham priority without Q, specifically Luke's use of Matthew, than there are that would argue for Griesbach. But, I mean, I might be wrong about that. You've got to throw into the equation as well. There are a few people these days that believe in Matthean posteriority, like the absolute opposite of what you're saying, the thing that Matthew's written third. I don't believe that, but I do think that one of the values of it is it actually helps us to diagnose some of those real similarities between Matthew and Luke, which is another huge issue which we haven't got into, I suppose. But no, I don't think, the Griesbach hypothesis is not really on the rise these days, I don't think. Though Griesbach was a brilliant man. He was one of the first, not actually the first, but one of the first people to put a synopsis of the Gospels together, and that's the beginning of good work, I think, on the synoptic problem.
Yeah, and once again, now I like yourself, I don't believe in a hypothetical Q document, except if we identify that Q document as Matthew. So,
yeah.
So I would say. Because once again, I do appreciate you dealing with the documents we have as opposed to what we do not have, and I think that's a very solid approach. For me, if the work of Matthew is brought into production to the churches, now, once again, I do see that as a physical transfer, so someone had to get in contact so they would know what came first. And given the spread of Christianity and its movement into Rome from Judea, then Peter, obviously at Jerusalem, had something to go off of, in addition to his testimony, to build his case for reaching converts in there. But in terms of literary analysis, and once again, you're more the expert on this, do you find that in Latin literature, so remember, he's preaching to, or what the documents say, he's preaching to a Roman audience. So now they're different in the Greek. So do we find more concise literature because we're dealing with a different audience? The Greeks tended to write on a whole bunch. I know Josephus points this out too, that the Greeks, they want to throw in all these stories and everything else, but the Latins were much more concise. And does this help explain why we see a shorter account? Because unlike the Greeks who want to hear all these stories, the Romans are much more concise. They're to the point.
No, I don't think I accept that. I think to be frank, I think it's too sweeping. And one of the things that you mentioned, Ed Sanders's tendencies of the synoptic tradition earlier on. One of the great things about that book is that he shows that amongst the synoptics, things go in kind of every direction. People always used to say, "Oh, Matthew always abbreviates Mark, and he always adds names rather than takes them away." And actually, he shows that the data goes backwards and forwards all sorts of different directions. So, I think one of the lessons from that book is also to be careful about more overgeneralizing about Greeks like this and Latin authors like that. It's very hard to make those sort of cases. Unfortunately, history often is more complex than that. And I say that as someone often gets accused of trying to make everything too simple. So I've actually, you hear how people misrepresent your own views. I'm always amused when I hear people say, well, Goodacre doesn't believe in Q because, he wants everything to be nice and simple, which is a kind of nonsense. But yeah, just to say that I've been accused of trying to oversimplify things as well, even though I don't think I do.
Yeah, no. What is your take? Now, I asked Dr. Ehrman this question during our debate, because one of the questions he posed to me was, well, I understand consensus is not evidence, but how do you explain the consensus? Now, I wanted to go into deeper conversation with Dr. Ehrman, and that's why I thought I'd post it here, because your field of study is on the opposite end of, looking at the higher criticism instead of the lower. So what do you think about, because, and I understand exactly where you're coming from on the analysis, but why do you think it takes 1,700 years for it to come into fruition, and then we tie it in to what Dr. Stephen Hicks, I'm not sure if you know him or not, but what he understands is a philosophical shift, the sort of breakdown of the epistemological method. They go more into speculative philosophy, and then all of a sudden we see these ideas come up. What are your thoughts on the correlation there, if there is?
Yeah, I mean, you're right to the correlation, but I think the diagnosis is wrong. The reason why it takes 1,700 years or however long is because, that's how long we had to wait for the Enlightenment to come. And basically what happens is, I know you'll probably be horrified by my saying this, but what happens is you get people beginning to do the kind of historical work that is now done in universities. And so I like to think that the kind of historical work that I do in a department of religious studies sits very comfortably in a department of classical studies or history, which indeed it does, because I teach history majors and classics majors all the time. And so I think, history is always evolving, and historical method is always evolving. And, even if you read history from 20 or 30 years ago, sometimes we're actually shocked by some of the things that historians did, especially the racism and sexism, which it invades, an awful lot of history, and of course still does. So I'm not saying that history is always getting better and better and better and better, but at the same time, I think the refinement of our historical approaches has often led us to do better history. That's why historical scholarship now is a lot better than it was in 1880. It just is. I mean, you read some of the scholarship from 1880, just even in terms of ludicrous generalizations and appalling caricatures about things. It's good that we've moved on from that. So I think, it's good to take the kind of skeptical overview that you take to the way that people sort of perform history in the modern era. But at the same time, the great thing about intellectual exchange is that you engage in it with groups of people who share similar, fundamental concepts, and, who can say, no, the evidence doesn't bear that out. No, the evidence doesn't bear that out. And how do you explain this piece of data? How do you explain that piece of data? So I don't know. I suppose maybe I'm just enthralled to critical history, and at the same time a bit of a spoil sport that I just enjoy, asking those questions. But then that's what you do if you're doing good history, isn't it? You just constantly ask questions and challenge what people have said. Just take, for example, Matthew 27, where when Jesus dies, there's an earthquake and lots of bodies rise up out of tombs, walk out of the tombs, and appear to people in Jerusalem. Now, most modern critical historians would say that there is a very serious question mark over that story. You can't, it's impossible to disprove that the zombies were walking around in Jerusalem when Jesus died. But at the same time, most critical historians would say the burden of evidence is on those that think the zombies were there, right? And that's reasonable way to perform history in the modern day, I think. And that's why a lot of people, to bring us right back to Matthean priority, it's one of the reasons why people are so skeptical about the idea that an eyewitness named Matthew, you saw these things, including which, by the way, all the disciples had fled anyway in Matthew's narrative. So he clearly hadn't witnessed that stuff anyway. So, but are we supposed to be calling on other people at some point?
Yes, the Q&A.
See, Derek's back.
I'm back. I've been here the whole time. I was an eyewitness. I just didn't tell anybody. You know what I mean?
Okay, nice one. Saw what you did there.
Yeah, you guys, this is really entertaining and also educational to see how you two are approaching this. Definitely coming from two totally different methods on how you're going to approach this. But I'm now going to Q&A. We've got one super chat here. I was hoping to be able to get some super chats for Q&A to help pop up the questions. If you guys want to super chat your question, feel free to ask. Our time is limited, though. We've only got another like 20 to 25 max minutes before Dr. Goodacre has to leave us here. But I'm going to try and pull up this super chat here and go ahead and ask. And I appreciate the super chat, Jim. The Gospel Before Mark by Pearson Parker, 1953. Yes. If there was no Q, was there a K? And we'll let you, Dr. Goodacre, start with that one. And then I don't know if you have any specific response you'd like to say.
Sure. No, I love Pearson Parker's work, but I find it even less plausible than the Q theory. Parker was one of those scholars who preferred complexity. This is where we're back to the topic of simplicity and complexity. But the problem is the more complex that you make your solution, the less likely it is to be accurately modeling antiquity. And all we're doing with this, we're trying to create models that replicate something as close as we can to antiquity. The more complex your contemporary model is, the less likely it is to model what actually happened in antiquity, right? So no, I don't think there was a K, unfortunately, or a P. A lot of people. There's some people in British scholarship used to think that there was a P and a Q. P being Peter's memoirs, which find their way into Mark, and Q being the thing that finds its way into Matthew and Luke. But there's even one claim, very dubious claim, that the letter Q does not derive from the German Quelle, German for source, but is actually the letter used because it comes after P, and P stands for Peter, but I don't think that's true either. So no, I don't believe in Q or P or K or M or L. I'm not sure where Jonathan is on those. Maybe we agree on that. Maybe we don't like the letters.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Goodacre, but I would qualify.
Come close to the mic, please, Jonathan.
Okay. Sorry about that. I would qualify all these Q, K as Bertrand Russell's philosophical teapot. I don't know if you would put it in the same identification, but you know, it's, well, yeah, I could look out there. There may be something, but it's just too small for us to find within the evidence. So it kind of spin on Russell's, there's some piece of debris floating out there between us and the asteroid belt. But, it's once again, there's nothing we can document. We have to explain if the early churches had it, why they get rid of it. It's not there. When we visit these places, they're not there. So I agree with Dr. Goodacre. There's no Q or L or M or OPQ. There's all these theories, but what we have to base on is what we see when we go into the churches. What we see is only Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I would just differ that Q is actually Matthew.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Got a super chat from Secular Rarity. Says, this is why I watch this channel. Great stuff, Derek. This channel always helps me learn. I appreciate it. This channel always helps me learn. I mean, it's amazing how that works, Seriously, though, like getting to be able to travel to go see Dr. Goodacre in person, which I hope to do again in the near future sometime before things pick up too busy for you, Dr. Goodacre. So I really appreciate the super chat. And thank you. And then he has a question, I believe. Question, what is the oldest archaeological evidence we have for Matthew and Mark, and why doesn't this alone answer which came first? So who wants to take a jab first?
Doctor, I could either go first or...
Well, I went first last time. Why don't you go first this time?
Okay. Well, I think the earliest record that we actually have from Mark is in Vaticanus. So that really goes to 325, possibly 350, if give or take a few years. That's the earliest of Matthew. Now, I know the Syriac. So when we talk about the Peshitta, what we have now, the origins of this go back even further. So apart from the Greek record, we do have a lot of early Aramaic documents. But but once again, we're only looking at what extant data we have, and where I tend to rely more on the information coming out of the churches, because we can document a specific time and place that they're writing. So Irenaeus, around 180 AD, he's at an epicenter at a church that would have had relevant documents and information that helps us answer this question. And since that church does go back to the first century, it kind of helps establish that unbroken chain of evidence. So I definitely turn it over to Dr. Goodacre on this. I think the extant materials don't always answer the question, because we're dealing with copies of copies that we have, not the actual originals.
Right. I mean, yeah. It's a tough one when you talk about archaeological evidence, because the papyrus fragments which we have of the Gospels, we have to date paleographically. In other words, we have to date them by looking at the handwriting and comparing it with other extant examples of text from the era. We do have 2nd century evidence of Matthew, but then again, we also have 2nd century papyrus fragments, possibly. I mean, all this thing is always arguable, of the Gospel of Thomas. And I actually think that used all 3 synoptic Gospels. So that points to the key fact, which is, is the accidental nature of remains. I mean, and so lots of those early papyrus fragments that we have of Matthew, of John, of Thomas, of Mary, of all sorts of things, lots of it comes from rubbish tips, like especially in Oxyrhynchus in Egypt. And so it's a question of accidental discovery, and so accidental discoveries will never tell you what document actually came first. They can be helpful, hugely helpful, but they'll never tell you which document actually was written first, because you're still dealing with copies of copies of copies, as Bart Ehrman would say.
Thank you. Yeah, Jim Majors, thanks for the super chat. He says, Dr. Goodacre, is it possible that Mark used Matthew but corrected Matthew incorrectly?
Yes, all things are possible, but not all things are equally plausible. And but it's a great question, because if Mark did correct Matthew, if it goes that way, then Mark is definitely much more of a kind of perverse author than we'd imagined. I mean, so it means that every time that Matthew says something unambiguous and clear, Mark muddies the waters, right? So just to take one of my favorite examples, when the disciples are walking down from the Mount of Transfiguration, in Mark's Gospel, there's this whole conversation about Elijah, and the disciples are going, oh, what's he talking about? I don't really understand. In Matthew's Gospel, same incident. Matthew, it says, then they understood that he was talking to them about John the Baptist. So he makes it absolutely clear Elijah was John the Baptist, right? Mark just hints at stuff all the time. It's kind of oblique. And I probably shouldn't mention this, because I know that Jonathan has some interesting views on the end of Mark's Gospel. But compare the end of Mark's Gospel with the end of Matthew. And if Mark has written that on the basis of Matthew, then I think that makes Mark a very strange author. Whereas if Matthew has written what he's written on the basis of Mark, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, the Matthean ending has been beloved by the church for many, many years for good reason. It actually reads better than the end of Mark's Gospel. Behold, I'll be with you always, even to the end of the age. That's a great ending, right? But they didn't say anything to anyone for they were afraid, if that's the original ending of Mark, or a bit of the secondary ending, Mark 16:9 to 20. Not as good an ending, I would say. So I think it's not possible. So I think it's not likely that Mark used Matthew and corrected him incorrectly, but I like the question.
Would you like to comment on that, Sheffield?
Yeah, and Jim Majors knows I love him to death. So I would say, once again, if we're looking at it linguistically from that standpoint, obviously, if Mark is hearing, so based on the external documents that Mark is trying to remember everything that he gathered, as opposed to someone like Matthew taking notes, a scribe, much more organized. Someone hearing that information, going back, and then this is where there's a little bit lost in translation. You get a couple of things wrong because you're trying to remember what you had actually heard from the sermons and put it to composition. And this is where I think an eyewitness observation, as opposed to someone taking notes, and maybe you can comment on this, Dr. Goodacre, from your students taking notes in your class. Do they always represent exactly what you said from a professor's standpoint? I know as a student going in, even in my master's program, I don't think I've done the best job. I'm actually a horrible note taker, so my notes would be horrible. So I'm glad I didn't have to write anything.
Just for the person who's wondering about Sheffield's bookshelf, he did have an earthquake happen, and it was a child, and he's got babies running around that house. So, yeah, lucky I'm out in the garage, and I can at least keep mine halfway decent. It's just hot as Hades in here. Jeremy Corvelis, thank you. I hope I said your last name correctly. Thank you for the super chat. Is it possible that Matthew, the Levite, did in fact write a sayings document? So I guess, Dr. Goodacre, however you want to answer that, whether short, sweet, and simple, or...
I'll answer the same way as the previous one. All things are possible, but not all things are equally plausible. Of course it might have done. I mean, but the question is, we don't work in that direction when you're doing this kind of history. You work from the other direction. You work with what we've got and then work from there backwards. And if a really great solution to the similarities between Matthew, Mark, and Luke was that Matthew, the Levite, wrote a sayings document, then that would be a popular theory. But I don't think it is a good answer to it, frankly.
Did you have a comment on that? You probably don't even agree with the...
Yeah, once again, if such a document did exist, it's the likelihood that it isn't found in any of the apostolic churches. So you talk about Rome, Jerusalem, Antioch. None of these documents come down. There's no real clear message outside of maybe what I hear are maybe more obscure comments by Papias. We do understand that even in the Gospels, you have the Pharisees bringing scribes with them, which probably meant they were trying to take down all the things that Jesus was saying in terms of to accuse against them. But we would expect, with the infrastructure that the churches are set up, that we would find these documents, and none exists, which means nothing has come down. That meant every apostolic see decided not to preserve it in a tradition based on preserving the documents that you receive. So I would have to agree that it's possible. It's another teapot, but it's not probable.
Thank you, gentlemen. Got another super chat here, Jim Majors again, and I think this will start with you, Sheffield, to get you to. What is the likelihood that Mark remembered Matthew verbatim in most every area except where he corrects Matthew?
Well, once again, likelihood, I'm not sure now if he's studious is taking down what Peter said. So if we look at it in the context that Matthew, and let's just say I'm just operating on the presumption of Matthew is the author. He's an eyewitness that he spent 3 years with Peter. They were at the Church of Jerusalem. They had a lot of contact. From that standpoint, and even though Dr. Goodacre would agree, this is where I bring in my Jack Ruby, that they're seeing the same events. The likelihood that they're going to give you this Jack Ruby's story is very very likely. I would agree, but
Dr. Goodacre?
Well, I mean, obviously, I think that Matthew used Mark and not the other way around. But it's an interesting question that this one brings in the question of memory, and I do think that memory is very, very important in understanding how the Gospels were written. For what it's worth, I've suggested in the past that Luke probably knew Mark more or less by heart. I think that he had a very, very good memory recall of Mark, which is one of the reasons that he's able to sort of pull things from different contexts quite easily. I think it's quite likely that Matthew had a pretty good memory recall of Mark as well, which is why sometimes just before the Sermon on the Mount, there's a place where you just have a whole bunch, just at the end of Matthew chapter 4, you have a bunch of things that sound like they're drawn from about 3 or 4 different Mark and contexts. And it might be just because he's got a good recall of Mark in his head. So I think memory is hugely important, actually, in the way that they did this. And I think sometimes people, when they talk about verbatim copying, they actually imagine the evangelist sitting there with their text in front of them, physically copying out. I don't think that's what happened at all, insofar as they consulted the text at all. They're consulting the text and they're reading it out to their scribe who's sitting over on the other side of the room. Well, not the other side, somewhere in the room. But a lot of the time they just remember it. Definitely, I'm sure of it. It's how they're able to make these great leaps across documents sometimes.
Okay, gentlemen, look, we're out of super chats and we're out of time to keep going with Q&A. So I think it's only fair, as we're exiting this, that you guys are highly critical of each other's position and say what you really think as you're leaving on a conclusion here. Let's start, Jonathan, since you started first, would you like to go first on the outro or him?
It's up to Dr. Goodacre if he wants to have the last word. Or
well, Dr. Goodacre is the first gospel, Mark. So it's a matter of, I'm just teasing. Who would you rather have go first here? And I'll go ahead and put you on the screen.
I guess allow Dr. Goodacre to make his final points. And a lot of good information here, but allow him to have his points.
Awesome. What do you really think, Dr. Goodacre? What do you really?
Sure. Well, I'll tell you what I think. I enjoyed the opportunity to get to talk to Jonathan and talk to the MythVision viewers too. I would say that if there's one thing that I think, for me, it's really, really difficult to dispute, it's that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are related on some level, on a literary level. Like, it's some way they're related on a literary level. And I think that is one of the real true consensuses in the field. And it's a consensus for good reason, because the similarities are so great. Verbatim agreement in wording, extensive agreements in order right across the text. Even the use of really strange literary expressions, they have to be related in a literary way in some way. And once you've made that decision, you then have to ask the simple genealogical question: is it more plausible that Mark gave birth to Matthew, and I would say also Mark and Matthew to Luke, than the reverse? And I think when you stare at individual passages in Mark, as well as the whole thing, I think you lose some of the joy of Mark's gospel if he's created that from Matthew. I think for Mark, there's a kind of brutish genius about Mark, if I can put it that way, because the language is often very rough and ready. And, he doesn't always finish his sentences, and he uses the word "and" too much and the present tense too much. But there's a sort of literary genius to the book. I mean, I go back and I've read it again and again and again and again and again and again and again. I still get new things from it every single time. And I find it more exciting if this was an original creative literary genius producing that, and that then Matthew comes along and does his also brilliant thing, but very different thing, clearing up a lot of the kind of rough edges around Mark and theologically trying to rescue some of the potentials for what might be seen as heresy by the document. So I think they're really the key things that I would say. And I would press Jonathan to think some more about the issue of what would a true eyewitness document actually look like, and is Matthew Gospel one of those kind of documents? Because I don't think it is. I don't think it looks like a true eyewitness document. But thanks for the debate.
Awesome, wonderfully said. Sheffield, tell us what you really think.
Once again, my intention and purpose, Dr. Goodacre is the expert in the academy. My thoughts was to really present my thesis to him, really help to understand, where are the holes in my logic, and better understand where he's coming from the academy. So in that regard, mission accomplished. Just a great mind. I think even in my talks with Dr. Richard Carrier, he has really spoken highly of Dr. Mark Goodacre. So, I think for me, when it boils down to how do we create a history, something that we can build upon, something that we can trust, and what I appreciate about historians like Arian, Thucydides, Polybius, is they're outside of our worldview. So they allow us to step back in time and kind of step out of the spirit of our times and look at it from a different perspective. And so when I look at how are we to build a history on the chronology of the New Testament and how did it come into being? For me, it's not a question of how did it evolve, rather, did it evolve? And what was the historical context of the period that brought about these writings? So when I look at it, obviously, I do have to deal with several facts in the literary analysis between the compositions of Matthew and Mark. There's similarity, how close they are, even though there's some differences. I do have to deal with that. Now, from my standpoint, if I have to go off the external data, those that were in a position to have that information, because the artifact cannot speak to us. So I definitely need, an Irenaeus or an Origin to speak to me about what happened in the church. How did we get to these documents? And given that the transmission of a document is physical, it does come into a church, someone has to take it over. Those churches, which are physical embodies of all these people, would naturally have information of that quality. I don't see any political motivations to distinguish Matthew as first. If anything, Dr. Goodacre's theory would make sense for Rome that, hey, we were the first to provide the written word, and now you not only worship Peter, but we were the first to bring you the word of God. So that's probably where I struggled the most in my analysis. But once again, Dr. Goodacre made a phenomenal argument. Definitely opened me up to, taking a different, maybe critical approach when I'm looking at some of his theories as well. So once again, overall, great conversation. Dr. Goodacre, you have been great and just a wealth of knowledge. And your accent definitely won over. Sure. I know my wife and my dad, they're watching it. They think you have the greatest of the accents. So it's been a pleasure listening to you.
Now, 16 years of living in North Carolina, and it's not rubbing off. But at least I've got the T-shirt.
Yes.
now you have the accent and a little y'all. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
hey, y'all.
right. Yeah. I like saying y'all. Yeah.
Really, really wonderful. I would love to have gotten into more topics and questions like, was Matthew initially written in Hebrew or Aramaic or something and then translated into Greek? These are questions that we have. Papias, I'd love to have dove into this and had you as a scholar pick apart what you think's going on with Papias. We don't have time for that today, and maybe we can make something happen with an upcoming show or questions. If you join the Patreon, you can ask these questions. I can record them with Dr. Goodacre in the future when I come to interview with him. And let me give a quick plug, if that's okay with you guys, to your websites and letting you guys know how you can help support what they do. So make sure you go subscribe to Jonathan Sheffield's YouTube. You can't miss it because he's got everyone, James White, the cartoon version of all the guys, Robert Price is in one of these videos. We got Bart Ehrman. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff. He likes to stir the pot. He created the intro to our show that you're going to see on the outro. So make sure you guys go subscribe to his channel. It's in the description. The New Testament podcast. Dr. Goodacre is asking everyone to go check it out. Let's help it grow so we can learn more from a scholar like him. He's right down the street, Duke University. So he does, how many have you had? Like 98 podcasts?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, there's another in the can.
So there's plenty of podcasts you can go to. And like he said to me in person, if you go to the first ones, he's apologizing in advance because you get better over time as you produce podcasts. So, but help support him and go to his website, markgoodacre.org. You guys, there's books, there's articles, get his works, help support what he does. He's a serious scholar in the field. And someone said, I need to set up a debate between you and Bart Ehrman on Q. But I thought, why would I get Bart Ehrman when we're going to go to like the leading head honcho on Q? Why not have a debate with you and some of the leading Q scholars? So who knows? We might could put something like that together. So thank you, gentlemen, for joining me here at MythVision.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thanks, Derek. Appreciate it.
Enjoy your stay. Is it England?
Mm-hmm.
Enjoy your stay in England. I look forward to seeing you in the future. Jonathan, I'll give you a call after this. And ladies and gentlemen, if you're lost, you just don't know your way, there's a community here at MythVision. And you could go ahead and just chant it with me because you know I say it every time I leave. We are MythVision.